Okay, now what I was thinking of, because there isn't a specific title and it just says you get to know about what I do and why I do it. So I'm thinking what I'll do is I'll speak for a bit of time, trying to explain and make sense of why I do what I do and what it means. And then I would like you to maybe just ask, comments or questions or things that I can as a dialogue sort of a process. Okay? Does that sound okay? Yes. Sound out? Okay, great. So to begin with, I was please Google me all you want, but the one thing you should never trust is my Wikipedia entry. Beginning from there, my Wikipedia entry is so you see, if you work on things that involve speaking truth to power, then your representation of who you are is always something that is contested, right? So I often have trolls who will go in and add things, everything ranging from she has a Pakistani husband, and I thought, I mean, let alone it's just a complete fabricated lies. So basically, just as a general rule, don't trust my Wikipedia entry, but anything else you can trust. From Google Scholar, my own website, everything else is okay, just not the Wikipedia entry. It has elements of truth in it, but it's not. Sometimes people just put random things on it. Um, so yeah. Anyway, okay, so we started with talking, you quoted Roosevelt, and I thought I'm going to just be very spontaneous and serendipitous with what I do today, and I'm going to just pick up signals from the room. So let me start with a quote from Kennedy, from John F. Kennedy, which I really like. It goes thus: anyone can change the world, and everyone must try. Right? So the idea of individuals thinking themselves to be powerless in the larger scheme of things is not just a truism, it's actually an ideological perspective that pushes people to think of themselves as powerless. Everything that you do in your life has meaning, not just at a very micro level, but also in the larger scheme of things. So it is important to always try to change the world. The other reason why you must always do that is because if you don't, if you fight, you may lose and you may win if you try to fight a good fight, right? But if you don't fight, you can't win. There's never a case for not making an effort to do the things that you want to do and to make the meaning that you want to make. So that's the first important thing that I want to say that has helped me in my life journey, not this book, which I came to later, but this idea that every single day is, and some of the simplest things are actually really profound, is a blessing. Every single day is the rest of your life beginning again. And therefore, whatever you do as students, as people who are in this, in academia, everything has meaning. And knowledge creation, I mean, I agree in a sense with what with Dr. Also said, that knowledge creation is a privilege, but it's a different kind of privilege. It's a privilege to be able to read and write and think. Thinking is a verb, it's an activity. Thinking doesn't just happen if you don't make it happen. If you want to eat, you have to eat. You have to make the effort to lift the food off the plate, even if it's served to you, right? So just as eating won't happen unless you do it, thinking won't happen unless you do it. So thinking is something that you must consciously think of doing and engage in. And part of that engaging in thinking is to constantly be on, as it were, about what you're seeing and what the reasons for those things might be. So the reason that my work is multidisciplinary, and I'll come to the multidisciplinary part more in a bit, is because I am led by an intellectual curiosity that then brings me back to what are the tools that I need to understand what I find interesting. So the idea of disciplines, and the idea is that if you are a conventional idea, that if you are doing, this subject, if you're doing science, then that little thing is all you do. If you're doing humanities, that little thing, sociology, that little thing, is useful in some ways because it allows people to deepen their knowledge about something, and that is really important because you need to have that understanding. But it's also important once you have sufficient depth to be able to broaden out and understand what are the outer frames of your understanding. When I say outer frames, I mean that what are the sorts of questions that you can't meaningfully ask within the confines of one single discipline. And the world is full of such questions. So if you think about questions of something very basic, say environment or poverty, all of these questions cannot, any of these questions actually, cannot be answered within the confines of a single discipline. Even if you think of yourself as literature scholars and you think, well, you know, if I'm telling a story about people who are experiencing poverty, then that's that. But even if you are telling that story, in order for that story to be meaningful, you would still need to have some experience of, observation of, and engagement with how that is experienced by other people. So there is absolutely no substitute for constantly understanding not just what one knows, but what is it that one's knowledge relies upon. And to know that, you know, you can go beyond that and ask these relevant questions across disciplines. So, and also, if you Google, since we're talking about Google, if you Google anyone from really, from Newton to Marx to, you know, any scholar, Baker, anyone that you Google, you will find that they're listed as was a theologian, philosopher, economist, you know, poet, whatever. Why? Because people have been asking questions across disciplines for a long time. This idea that we should all be like little ants who don't ask the bigger questions is a politically useful idea for systems to not be questioned, for there not to be critical thinking. Because the idea itself of knowledge as being compartmentalized into disciplines is a 19th century phenomenon. So it's actually in the period between I write more about it elsewhere, but in the period 1850 to 1900, for the first time ever, you have a standardization of the world originating in the West, but a standardization which means we have to have censuses. We have to know how people are living. We have to have knowledge that is compartmentalized into knowledge of this discipline, that discipline, and something else. And also, what is the other interesting thing you have happen in that period? It's the high noon of imperialism. So knowledge making was very much tied to the exercise of power. And in order to exercise power, in order to colonize and so on, you need to have knowledge. You can't. So knowledge making has never been an innocent endeavor free of power. And therefore, it is vital that when we create the knowledges, we reflect upon them. So disciplinarity and this idea that science is the only most valid form of knowing and every other knowing is inferior to it is all a historically located endeavor. It's not always been like this. For much of human history, people didn't think in these terms that are very narrow. So hence the multidisciplinarity makes sense. Now, I think the linked to scientism, and maybe I should mention this point here, is that there is, do you know what STEM subjects are? STEM, science, technology, engineering, medicine type subjects. So increasingly all over the world, there's this idea that STEM subjects is what we should focus on, not humanities. History is a waste of time, literature is a waste of time, poetry is a waste of time. This idea that, you know, humanities are somehow not necessary. And this is again a very flawed way of looking at the world. Because what humanities and social sciences give us is no less valid than what we get from science, technology, engineering, medicine, which are also important. So Dr. Asaf can save someone when they are experiencing pain because he has a knowledge of the human body, of aspects of the human body. But the rest of us who have a similar title of doctor are not saving lives in that immediate sort of, we're saving your life right now, you're in a crisis. But education and the ability to think critically and understand the world around you is also a life-saving skill. In a longer term, it's a slow motion life skill. You won't see it in one moment. See how that makes a difference and how that helps in addressing various kinds of injustices. Because we can recognize violence very easily when it's physical. We recognize violence very easily when it's spectacular. But what we find as society is harder to recognize is structural violence. And it's a term from a theorist called Galton, you might know. So structural violence is a violence that happens cumulatively in a very small scale way over a long period of time. So somebody is not dying on the street because they were killed, but lots of people are dying over a long period of time because they can't afford the medicines that have been priced out of their reach in a private healthcare system. That's a classic example of structural violence. There is violence, but it's not like a one-off thing. You don't see it. That doesn't mean it isn't toxic or insidious or very socially harmful. So in order to address the structural violence that many societies that we all experience in different ways in different societies, it is important to think critically. The other reason why critical thinking is important is to prevent the slide from democracies into totalitarianisms. Democracies have 100,000 problems, but they're the least worst system that we know in our as a human society. So if you think about the what happened during the Second World War, what precipitated the Second World War, what was happening in German society, the widespread anti-Semitism, the prejudice and discrimination against minorities, which in that case were Jews, but also Romas and Gypsies and homosexuals and others. So this persecution of minority identities in society and othering them, which then led to large-scale killing of these people, happened and was done by very good people, inverted commas. Why were they good? Because they thought of themselves as good. They thought they were doing the right thing by assisting in people in the killing of members of their own community. And this is something now that we see happen in multiple countries. People who send their children to school on time and pay their bills and smile at each other and are very nice and helpful are also at the same time involved in projects of hate against others and minorities. And this kind of slide into slide away from democratic rights into totalitarianisms. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, who was a philosopher of totalitarianism in the 20th century, when she talks about it, she says that the decline of critical thinking in the public sphere is the most important way in which that happens. Because when we don't have a public sphere where we are able to talk and discuss and think critically, that's when it becomes possible to legitimize all kinds of violence, because people just accept it. They don't question, they don't question it. So therefore, critical thinking is important. Humanities and social sciences are an important part of it. All kinds of work are an important part of it, and including, for instance, I would argue political fiction that makes people think and empathize and understand how justices are experienced or how alienation is experienced and so on. So that's one thing I wanted to say. Now, what else? Just picking up from what they said. So travel. Why is travel an important part of this story? Travel is an important part of my story, certainly, because we never really know where we are. The post-colonial theorist Spivak, in one of her books, says that the key to where you are is an amalgam of emphases conveyed by travel, otherness, and being. Because where you are depends on your context, on what is surrounding you. It's not just a geographical coordinate. And in that sense, travel makes the familiar into the strange. And that's the origin of theorizing. So you may always think that this is the way I do things, this is the way my people do things, and that's the right way. When you travel, you go to a place or a context. It could also be a different part of your own city. You go to a context where you see people are doing things differently, and that idea of questioning what you always thought was familiar and experiencing strangeness and difference and otherness is the starting of that friction that then makes you think, okay, well, how come it's done this way, or what does it mean to do it this way? So that spark, travel is an important part of creating that spark. And travel doesn't only mean physical travel. Travel can also be picking up a book from a library that is about something that you don't know, or another historical period or people and reading it. That's also a kind of time travel, right? So that travel, the idea of traveling and making the familiar into the strange, is an important part of how you think and how you come up with questions that you need then to have answered. And likewise, belonging is a word. In my first novel, Residues, which I don't have a copy of, but it was, when it was published, it was the first novel in English by a female Kashmiri novelist, and it was also the only one in the shortlist that was by a woman, and I'm quite actually pleased about that. So when Residue was published, one of the things that that I say in a book, one of my characters says, is the word belonging itself has this longing. The word of, so what belonging is in fact belonging to be a part of something. And then the question is, well, why do we want to belong? What does belonging give us? And at different times, for different sets of people, why do you want to belong to this community or this country or this region or whatever? So belonging gives us certain kinds of things, certain kinds of values that make meaning for us, and that's not a stable thing. So this is the problem with, I guess, if we think about belonging in purely and narrowly ethnic terms, as very many totalitarian societies do, and they're like, no, you cannot belong to this country if you don't look like this, because that's a narrow idea of belonging. But a wider idea of belonging does not link it to ethnic or other identity. It links it to something more social, something more civic. And this is why civic nationalism is the preferred, if nationalism is something that can ever be preferred, is a preferred version of it as opposed to ethnic nationalism. And ethnic nationalism sadly is on the rise globally in many countries now more and more. So the idea of, so Einstein said, while we're on nationalism, I can't let go of the opportunity to include this quote, that nationalism is a weasels of the mind. And I feel it is to an extent true, in that nations are, as Benedict Anderson said, imagined communities, right? We imagine that we are part of this nation, and it's good if it's good. But when it becomes problematic is when we start to expel and intimidate and practice violence against those who we think cannot belong to this. So belonging is a double-edged sword. It works for certain kinds of identities much better than others, and that tends to be a majority-minority split in most places. So when we think of belonging, we shouldn't take it as an uncritical concept. I mean, the best way to belong, I think, would be to think of belonging in a more planetary sense, because like birds in the clouds, because everything from acid rain to reverse to the good and the bad basically does not respect the lines that we make on bits of paper. And it's always been very curious to me how we can care about death up until a certain geographical coordinate, and if death happens or injustice happens 1 meter away from that particular geographical coordinate, we're quite happy to be totally indifferent to it. And this is, I think, one of the problems, because if everyone is doing that, then it adds up to a collective problem, right? Now, what I think the last part of what I want to say is to find a good way of summarizing. So this is the novel that it's a novel about Kashmir, but it's a novel that talks about different kinds of Kashmiris. They're all young people, and they're it's about their friendships and also how difficult it is to realize big dreams on a very small canvas. And conflict makes the canvas of a life very small. You can't realize many things for reasons that have nothing to do with you. You cannot realize that if you live in a conflict zone. So that's the sort of question that this poses and urges us to think. The words future and tense, it's also called future tense as a way of referring to the simultaneity of time that was mentioned earlier. So the words are in barbed wire. The lettering is in barbed wire. And the reason it's in barbed wire is it's again to draw attention to the confinement, to the experience of conflict, confinement, and the desiccation of dreams, the drying up of dreams that happens to people who are like you and me, just people who want to do things, but how difficult it becomes to do them, and how a very kind of basic level of human interrelationality for people with each other completely gets destroyed in the face of larger ideologies, and that's what this book attempts to get at. And I did mention that my previous novel, Residue, which is so this is about Kashmiris and it's set in Kashmir. Residue was set in different cities, but so Shantinikethan and Delhi played a role, and Berlin and Bristol played a role. But much of it was set in Berlin, and Berlin is a city that those of you might remember, some of you might remember from history, is a city that was divided throughout most of the Cold War. So there was East Berlin and West Berlin. So Berlin is the city which is inside, inside. So there's Germany is divided, and then inside Germany, Berlin is divided, because Berlin is placed inside East Germany, but it's actually half of it is West Germany. And that division, that physical divisions, also create gaps in people's empathy and their ability to imagine the other. So just like that division, we still have, of course, line of control. So the divisions, the physical divisions in cartographic sense, those divisions, the landscape divisions, actually also create absences of identity, absences of empathy, and absences of affinity at a human level. And so the characters in that book, in Residue, were referencing that Cold War era and looking back to the past. The more immediate, easy way of telling you this is that the central character Leon was the son of a communist activist, and his father had disappeared in Berlin. So that's part of how that search and narrative happens. And in future tense too, it's these these kinds of the claustrophobia of conflict and how it affects young lives, I guess, is how I would mention and summarize this. So fiction for me, and I would argue fiction is never apolitical, even when it claims to be apolitical. It has some sort of politics attached to it. But politically, explicitly political fiction, such as the kind that I write, has a rationale in that political fiction is meant to make you experience, empathize, but also think about the stories that you may only have heard in newspaper, from newspapers or the TV channels. So everything from Uncle Tom's Cabin to Of Mice and Men, any texts, so many texts that you can think of that you might have studied are actually political fiction. They're talking about the Depression, or they're talking about slavery, or they're talking about something that is, in fact, generally seen as a political thing. Fiction is storytelling, and most of what we do is tell stories in our lives, and some of those stories we put in different languages, and we add an analytical depth to it, and then it becomes a social scientific story. But in the telling, there's still a story in it. And why stories are important is because the narratives of dispossession, delegitimization are at the end of the day narratives. If people don't agree with them, if you don't give the consent to why something should happen, it cannot happen. So any kind of dispossession, injustice only happens when there is a persuasive narrative attached to it. And therefore, including in politics, the appeal is not so much the policy at any point, it's the story that is told to a policy, about that policy, to groups of people who come to identify with it. So stories are really, really powerful, in fact, almost kind of magical in the amount of power they exercise over human action. People think that ideas and actions are opposed to each other. In fact, ideas are a kind of action, because without an idea, you can't have the action happen. So these two things are very much correlated. And therefore, the interrogation of these narratives and the institutionalizations of knowledge trajectories that I was referring to earlier. How does this come to be an economic question, and why is it not a political question? Why is it not a social question? Or how is it a question that belongs to the realm of culture as opposed to the economy? Are the common threads in my work. I don't think there's much I want to say other than this, except to add that if I look at, you look at the sky and you see stars. So if I look at the firmament, as it were, of my thought processes over time, what are the interesting stars that I think one interesting star is this idea of marginality, what it means in different contexts. I think asking that question, what is the marginal perspective here, is a really powerful move, because the margins are where you see the world most clearly from, because you're both inside and outside. You don't share the assumptions of the center, and you are not totally away from the center to be completely disconnected. So the margin is a very interesting place intellectually for critical thinking. That's one, I would say. The other is, I think, this idea of simultaneity, that it's very easy to say something and see something in binary terms, and it's yes or it's no. It's there or it's not there. But the simultaneity of something being yes and also being no, also the title of a very interesting essay from Albert Camus called Between Yes and No. But the simultaneity of two contradictory positions is, again, I think, a very interesting place intellectually for critical thinking, because if you think about it, all our lives are conducted with the simultaneity of hope and hopelessness. That, that we are constantly able to hope, which is why we do anything at all and don't give up. But also, there is, at the end of the day, we also realize that there's a certain hopelessness in inability to achieve many of the things that we would want to achieve. So simultaneity, or the idea of simultaneity, and those of maybe from the literature students will recognize the idea of the absurd here, is part of that. The simultaneity of mortality and immortality. Everyone in this room is going to die, and yet at the same time, we live all of our lives as if that would never happen, and therefore are not as thoughtful about the meaning that we must make while we are on this planet. So the simultaneity of things being the case and also not being the case. I think life margins is a very good and rich place to think from, interesting place. And otherness. I think that otherness is the idea of who the other is for you. Does that ever change? How does that change? Are you some another to an identity? And what are the dynamics of how that comes to happen in specific grounded contexts? That's where I think the rigor is important, because it's and that's the move that you must make. The African novelist Ngugi Thiong'o once talked about the middle place in the, it's neither bank, it's the thing in the middle when you're switching the zoom lens, if I use a camera metaphor. When you look at something in the distance and when you look at something really close up in a macro, the thing in between when you are switching is where you're making the interesting analytical transitions. So thinking about how that, the binary is decided between the inside and the outside, or between us and them, that's, I think, also a good place. But I'd like to just close by saying your literature students, you read and write stories. Stories are powerful. The way I think of it is, so if I'm asked, why did you ever start writing, which I have been asked in more than one interviews, I would say that when I used to read a lot. I think as children who are really solitary also read a lot. So I was reading a lot, and every time I would finish a book, I would remain curious about the lives of those characters that ended with that book, and think about, okay, and then what happened after that. And that was the impulse of imagination, to try and imagine the lives that I didn't know that weren't on the page. Even now during the pandemic, I read a lot, but now as work becomes much more busy, I haven't been able to. So if I have like 3 books that I've read at two different page numbers of pages, I sometimes feel a bit bad, because even now I'm feeling like there are those characters stuck in that room and they're still waiting for me to go back to them and wake them up from wherever they are and find out what they're going to do next, or at a railway station or something. Anyway, I think I've gone on for too long.